A sharp bang of a suitcase against the spotless airport floor cut through the morning hum in the busy terminal. Heads turned. A sharp-dressed man in his late 50s scowled, rubbing his wrist as the leather duffel bag fell from his grasp. "Watch where you're going," he snapped at the passing flight attendant. His Rolex glinted under the fluorescent lights. The woman he spoke to, poised, calm, her navy blazer pressed to perfection, bent down with ease, lifting the bag and handing it back with a polite nod. "My apologies, sir," she said smoothly, her tone neutral, professional. The man snorted, barely acknowledging her. Behind him, his small group of companions chuckled under their breath. They were the type who occupied VIP lounges, people whose wallets outweighed their manners. One of them, a sleek-looking woman draped in designer brands, smirked. "She's probably hoping for a tip," she muttered just loud enough to be heard. Another man, younger but just as smug, checked his watch and snorted. "They all do, just trying to get on our good side." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Laura Simmons, didn't bat an eyelash. She'd heard it all before. A decade in the airline industry had taught her that some people stared right at you and yet never really saw you. She only smoothed her blazer and turned back to her duties. But today wasn't a normal day. She had moved through the gate area, getting the crew ready for boarding. She had watched the group, the postures, the tossing off gestures, the entitled sneers. The whole thing was too familiar. They weren't here to take a flight. They were here to be served. The gate agent's voice crackled over the speakers. "First-class passengers for Flight 708 to New York. You're welcome to board at this time." The group strutted toward the gate like they owned the airline itself. One of them, a man in his early 40s, tapped his boarding pass against the counter with an exaggerated sigh. About time. Laura stood near the door, greeting passengers as they came aboard. When the group approached her, she smiled professionally. "Welcome aboard," she said. The man barely looked at her, handing over his pass. "Let's keep the champagne cold, sweetheart." The woman beside him snickered. "If she even knows what that means." The group laughed again, and didn't know that the flight attendant they were laughing at had been the one who designed the exact service they would receive. Laura just nodded and stepped aside as they passed her. She'd learned long ago people were themselves when they thought no one important was listening, and today they would learn a lesson they'd never forget. The plane hummed softly as passengers settled into their seats. Business class was almost full. An air of subtle opulence draped over the section. The wealthy group from the terminal had already reclined themselves in their chairs before takeoff, their designer carry-on bags tucked neatly under the footrests. In the front came a young flight attendant, no older than 25 years, with a warm smile curling her lips. "Can I offer you a pre-departure drink?" she said, proffering a tray of sparkling wine. The man in the gray suit, just as well cut, hardly turned to her. Lifting his head, he brushed her off as if she was some afterthought. Yeah, just keep 'em coming." The woman next to him, a vision in Louboutin and Louis Vuitton, peered down her nose into the tray of drinks before pulling out a flute. "Better be good too. The champagne on my business flight last week tasted like truck stop swill." Laura's eyes met Catherine's as her friend stood nearby, near the galley. She heard. She wasn't surprised. Money, status people like them perpetually thought entitled them to disrespect. She watched as one of the men, a younger one with a crisp white dress shirt, no tie, snapped his fingers at the same flight attendant. "Hey, ice, and make it quick." The girl hesitated for just a second before nodding. "Of course, sir." Laura stepped forward. "I'll handle it," she said smoothly, taking the glass from the young attendant's hand. The man barely glanced up at her. "Good, just don't water it down." Laura nodded, disappearing into the galley. As she reached for the ice bucket, she took a slow breath. Years of experience had taught her composure. But there was something about this group, the bald entitlement, the lack of consideration for those around them, that made her jaw tighten. She turned back, returning with the ice, her expression unreadable. "Here you go, sir," she said, placing the glass in front of him. He didn't say thank you. He didn't even acknowledge her, just took the drink and continued talking to his companions, laughing at a joke only they found amusing. As Laura walked away, she heard one of them mutter under his breath, just loud enough to sting. "These flight attendants are all the same, here to serve, nothing else." She didn't stop, didn't react. But something in her gut told her, this flight was about to teach them something they'd never forget. The cabin had settled into a quiet rhythm. The steady hum of the engines filled the space as passengers flicked through in-flight entertainment screens or scrolled absent-mindedly on their phones. Dinner service was underway, and the rich aroma of freshly prepared meals wafted through the aisles. Laura wove through the aisles, her gaze passing over her crew. Efficient, attentive, just as she'd trained. Business class wasn't as reassuring, though. The tension in that cabin still felt like the approach of a storm cloud outside. The party of wealthy travelers had settled down to eat now, but they had done it grudgingly. A man in a navy blazer who had spent the last 20 minutes bragging about his latest business venture poked at his chicken with the tine of his fork. He frowned, then leaned back melodramatically. "This is dry," he muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. He turned his gaze toward a passing flight attendant. "Is this really the best you people can do?" The words fell heavy. A few passengers looked up, furrowing their eyebrows. The young flight attendant whom he had spoken to hesitated, faltered. Laura, standing just feet away, stepped in before it could escalate into a scene. She approached him with calm precision, her voice smooth as silk. "I'm so sorry to hear that, sir. Would you like something else instead?" The man barely glanced at her. "You know what? Forget it. I'll just eat later." He pushed the plate away as if it had offended him. His companion, the woman draped in luxury, let out a scoff. "And can someone do something with these seats?" she added, adjusting her position with exaggerated discomfort. "I expected luxury. This feels like a step above economy, barely." She turned to Laura then, eyes narrowing slightly. "Oh wait, do you even understand what I'm saying?" Laughter rippled through their group. The insult was deliberate, a test. Laura's fingers curled slightly against her palm, but her expression remained neutral. "I assure you, ma'am, passenger comfort is a priority. If you'd like a pillow or blanket, I'd be happy to provide one." The woman rolled her eyes. "Just don't mess it up like the meal." Nearby passengers exchanged uneasy glances. A middle-aged couple whispered to each other. A young man across the aisle discreetly raised his phone, recording. Laura met the eyes of the young flight attendant still standing nearby. A silent reassurance passed between them. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the galley. She had dealt with people like this before, but something told her their arrogance wouldn't last much longer. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly as the jet cruised at 35,000 feet. Most passengers had nestled into their seats, a few watching movies, others dozing off. A quiet calm had taken over the flight, except in business class. The conversation amongst the well-to-do continued as their voices sliced through the steady hum of the aircraft. Stocks and bonds, real estate and vacation homes, in locations the average man would only read about, flowed freely from their mouths. This was just another aggravation in a life between pleasures. Then, it happened. A sharp gasp, a tray crashing to the floor. One of the gentlemen, the one who had been wearing that very expensive watch, suddenly clutched his chest. His face contorted, and his breathing turned shallow, uneven. Reaching for his throat, he heaved in his seat, falling forward onto the aisle. Pandemonium erupted. His companions immediately rose from their seats. The arrogance swiftly turned to panic. "Somebody help!" someone shouted out. His voice was cracked and laced with fear. Passengers turned, alarm flashing across their faces. Some frantically pressed call buttons while others craned their necks to see what was happening. Laura was already moving. She knelt beside the man, her voice steady and controlled. "Sir, can you hear me?" She lightly tapped his shoulder. Her trained eyes scanned his face. His skin went white, beads of sweat on his forehead. He labored for breath, too shallow. "Do something," one of his friends yapped, all condescension now gone. "Why aren't you doing anything?" Laura ignored him. She reached for the man's pulse weak. Too weak. She turned to a crew member standing nearby. "Get the first aid kit and oxygen mask, now." The young flight attendant scurried away. Laura looked up at the knot of people. "Is he on any medication? Does he have any medical conditions?" They exchanged helpless glances. The woman in designer clothes stammered, I don't know. He's never said anything." The panic in their voices was real now. A few rows away, a middle-aged man unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. "I'm a doctor," he announced, stepping forward. "I can help." Laura moved aside as the doctor knelt next to her. She quickly filled him in on the man's condition, her calm demeanor unwavering. The doc examined him and then looked up at Laura with raised eyebrows. "You did everything right so far," he said. "Let's get him stabilized." The rich people that had been so full of themselves now clung to every word Laura and the doctor said. Fearful, it had stripped them of their arrogance. As Laura secured the oxygen mask over the man's face, She felt their eyes on her, watching, realizing. They had spent the entire flight looking down on her. Now, she was the only hope for their friend. The cabin fell silently from its casual chatter and clinking of glasses as every eye now fixed on this drama unfolding in business class. The arrogant group, which hitherto had acted so full of themselves, sat stock still, pale faces, with their friend slumped forward in his seat, an oxygen mask secured over his mouth. The doctor moved quickly, feeling the man's pulse, regulating the oxygen. His eyebrows furrowed slightly. "He is stabilizing," he said, though there was a trace of worry in his voice. "But he needs to go to the hospital as soon as we land." Laura stood behind them, her face unreadable. She had seen emergencies before. She'd handled them. But something in this moment was different. The rich passengers who had been treating her as some nameless servant only a few hours ago sat silent. The woman in designer clothes, who was so smug a while back, now clutched the armrest, her nails digging into leather. One of the men, who earlier flicked his hand to dismiss Laura, stared at her as though he saw her for the very first time. How did you know what to do?" he asked, his voice unsure. Laura didn't say anything at once. Instead, she adjusted the oxygen mask slightly and looked at him. "It's my job," she replied. The man swallowed hard and nodded, but there was now something else in his eyes. Guilt. Shame. The woman spoke much smaller now. "If you hadn't been here—" The words weren't finished, since her throat was choked up. Laura looked over at the doctor, who nodded in a small sign of approval. "He's stable for now, thanks to you." The tension in the air did not break, it merely relocated. The silent passengers who had seen it all sat wordless, trying to wrap their minds around what had just happened. The group of rich travelers, so smugly certain of their own superiority, now whittled down to a few beings huddling together and holding on to the fact that the person they had decried was the one who had just saved their friend. The realization had begun to set in, and the flight wasn't over. The cabin hummed along as the tension began to settle in. What was once a loud, boisterous cabin full of arrogant wealth was now eerily quiet. Something silent replaced their boisterous voices. Their friend remained reclined in his seat, still pale but his breathing steady. The doctor said he was stable, but it did little to reassure them. Laura stood several feet away and watched. She had witnessed metamorphoses before, people who in a moment changed from entitled to humbled. But this was different. It wasn't just an emergency. It was all about perception. How fast someone could go from invisible to indispensable. One of the men, the one who had snapped his fingers at the crew earlier, shifted uncomfortably. His fingers tapped against the armrest as if searching for something to say. Finally, he cleared his throat. I didn't know flight attendants were trained for this." His voice lacked its earlier confidence. Laura met his gaze, her expression neutral. "We're trained for a lot of things," she said. The woman in designer clothes, so quick with the acid tongue, looked over at her friend before turning back to Laura. Her lips pursed like she was biting it. Then, in a near whisper, she said, "I think we owe you an apology." A moment of silence ticked by. A few rows forward, another passenger stirred in his seat, too obviously listening. Laura said nothing for a moment. She had heard her share of sorries before, some sincere, some as empty as the jingle of loose change flung out to appease a giver's conscience. But something in the tone of this woman was different. Apologies were words. Change was action. She turned and looked again at the man who still lay sleeping under the oxygen mask, then turned back to the group. "I appreciate that," she said with evenness, "but respect shouldn't come just because of a crisis." She looked down, her throat working hard. The others avoided eye contact, but their body language had shifted. Shoulders that had once been squared in superiority slumped now with something that looked a lot like regret. Laura adjusted her blazer and stepped back toward the galley, leaving them to sit with their thoughts. The flight wasn't over yet, but for them, something had already changed. The minute ticked by with increasing loads of silence in the business class. The group of rich passengers who had been so boisterous got subdued, the drinks untouched, the laughter silenced. Their friend, still under the oxygen mask, stirred a bit. His breathing was regular but weak. The doctor sat near him, keenly observing him. Laura stood in the galley, taking a measured breath. She had seen this kind of shift before, the one where people realized their status, their wealth, their carefully built image accounted for nothing when it came to the real moments in life. They were no longer in control of a thing. A soft voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Ma'am?" She turned to find one of the younger flight attendants, the same one who had been humiliated earlier. Her hands were clasped in front of her, hesitant. They asked for you." Laura raised an eyebrow but nodded. She adjusted her blazer and stepped back into the cabin. The others were waiting. The designer-suited woman who had paid so little attention to Laura initially spoke first now. "We wanted to thank you," she said, her voice much softer than earlier, "for everything." One of the men, previously so fast to write her off, rubbed his palms together before looking up. "We were wrong about you," he said. "About all this." Laura studied their faces. Hanging from their faces was regret, but more than that, understanding. They weren't just embarrassed, they were changed. She nodded slightly. "I appreciate that," she said evenly, "but it's not about me." She nodded toward the young flight attendant standing nearby. "It's about how you treat people, not just in emergencies, always." The group looked at each other. Nobody spoke, but there was no need for that. The lesson was learned. She blew her breath again, slower. "We shall remember this," she said. This time it sounded like she meant it. Laura nodded, wordless, and stepped aside. Some lessons don't need anything more. The last hour of the flight was spent in near silence. Business class, once a stage for arrogance and entitlement, had become almost contemplative. The wealthy group, who had spent the beginning of the journey treating the crew like background noise, were now still, their gazes distant, their movements subdued. The man who had fainted was conscious, his breathing slow but regular. The doctor seemed to reassure one and all that he would be fine once they landed, but the mood hadn't lifted. Something in the core had shifted. The plane started its descent, and Laura began to make her way down the aisle, checking on passengers one last time. The usual routine: seatbelts, trays up, everything in order. When she reached the wealthy group, they all looked up at her as one. For the first time, their expressions weren't full of expectation, but of something closer to gratitude. The woman in designer clothes hesitated before speaking. I don't think we'll ever forget this flight." Laura nodded, offering the same measured professionalism she had since the beginning. "Safe travels," she said simply. But just as she was turning back to her checking, the sudden flinging arm, the brush of fingers down across her wrist, it was barely a touch, a cautious, light, and almost tentative one. She remained frozen, only turning her gaze to him. He was still pale, yet dot in his eyes, bright with something, held a semblance different now. "Who am I?" he whispered gruffly. Laura's head tilted a fraction. There was no arrogance in the question, no demand, just genuine curiosity. She held his gaze for a moment before replying, "Just someone doing their job." Smoothly, the plane touched down in a glide, its wheels skimming the runway before settling into a firm, steady roll. A quiet murmur spread through the cabin as passengers reached for their belongings, ready to disembark. Standing near the exit and bidding goodbyes to passengers as they went their separate ways, Laura noticed something quite unexpected. The wealthy group had been hanging around toward the back. None of them seemed in any particular hurry to get off and be the first ones out. When they finally made it to her, fully dressed in designer clothes, the woman fumbled before handing her something, a folded note slightly crumpled from being held too tightly. Laura took it without uttering a word. The woman inclined her head very slightly, almost bashful, and joined the ranks, disappearing off the plane. It wasn't until they were well gone that Laura opened up the paper. At first it appeared to be a note of thanks, but under the phone-scrawled apologies and thank yous there was more: a receipt, a donation, a large donation in Laura's name, to an organization focused on supporting air transportation staff and more emergency response training. Laura looked at it for a very long time. Then, for the first time that flight, she allowed herself a small, knowing smile. She folded the paper neatly, tucked it into her pocket, and stepped forward to prepare for her next journey.